Hello, everyone. My name is Jay Brown. This is my podcast, and I want to welcome you to it. Thanks for listening. I'm still in Japan, and it's the middle of the night again. I totally adjusted to the time, but what happened is yesterday was the 5th of 7 days teaching here in Japan, and they're intensive days. They're 6 to 7 hours of actual teaching time, and it's pretty grueling. Those of you who are listening and have done those kind of programs, you know what I'm talking about. And I got home last night, and I was going to do a little bit of work, and I just passed out early, and then now it's the middle of the night again. So I thought I might try to capitalize on the moment, because I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to record for the podcast while I'm doing these training intensives, because it's just a terrible idea. It's so much work. I'm just exhausted. But I'm going to do my best. My talk today with Donna, Farhi, really, I don't know, it's speaking to my current situation. You see, Donna and I talk about how many of us in our earlier years did practices that essentially pulled our bodies apart. And now we're doing our best to knit them back together and find more stability. At least I am. Maybe I should only speak for myself. And that is sort of coming home to roost for me this week, because I'm so tired that all these pain issues come out again, you know? Like when I'm fatigued and I'm not having enough downtime, that's when my body revolts. It says, man, would you stop already? And I screwed myself a little bit, because I arrived here in Japan already on empty. And that's because before I left, there was just so much going on, and I just felt like I got to try to take care of this stuff before I get to Japan. And so I really was pretty exhausted when I got here already, and I don't know why I thought I would be able to rest when I'm here when I have so much work to do. So my body's falling apart a little bit. It's okay. The trainings are going great. The students here in Japan are amazing, and I'm having a very rewarding experience in terms of the work, but I had to teach in a chair for the last 2 days because my sacroiliac joint was screaming at me so much. And you know, I deal with SI joint pain over the years, and I generally can manage that pretty well. It doesn't in any way affect my ability to do what I would normally do. But this week it did. It actually got to a point where I felt like, wow, if I ignore this, I don't think my body's going to make it through the trip. So in a way, I just used it as an example. I just talked with the teacher trainees about this, you know. And there's this one guy in the training, and he has spent the last 26 years living in a community of what he calls mountain monks. And I was working with him as an example the other day in a pose. I was amazed by his body. I was so jealous. He was so solid and like strong. And I think it's because his body's been developed that way from like lifting wood and like working in the mountains, you know? I talk about this with Donna in the talk today, about like the difference between a body that develops from like actually working in their life activities like with the land and stuff, as opposed to what happens to a body when all it really does is like walk to the yoga center and do poses. It's sort of divorced from function at a certain point. That's what I was talking with Peter Blackaby about a couple weeks ago, you know? This is all really, really hitting home for me personally. And my conversation today with Donna it's just so completely on point. I've been thinking about it a lot since we've had it. I've been in contact with Donna several times via email. And I'm excited for you guys to hear it. What else? Last week in the outro, I dropped a bit of information and only a few people contacted me. Maybe you guys were just, giving me space, or maybe you didn't listen to the outro, which is fine. Maybe not everybody listens to that. Maybe they turn it off after the interview, but I did mention that I'm going to be closing down my yoga center at the end of this year. I don't know if you caught that. It's something I've talked about on this podcast a lot. The struggles of being an independent yoga center owner, and my lease was going up at the end of the year, and I had to decide, and I decided I'm not going to do it. The rent's going up, and even if I could make it happen with the rent, it doesn't seem plausible. When I look back at it, the center grew every year. Every year the center grew for 7 years, I'd say. And then at 7 years, it hit its full growth, its full health. I talked about this with Douglas Rushkoff, if any of you remember that talk. And at that 7-year point, if we could just have stayed there, I think the center could truck on indefinitely. But every year the rent goes up, every year expenses go up. That means that the center has to grow. In order to stay healthy, a center has to be growing every year. Unless, of course, you own the building, or you live somewhere not as ludicrous as Brooklyn, where you can get some kind of sustained rent situation, But if you don't have that, if it always goes up every year, then it's unsustainable. There's no way you can grow like that forever, And also, I just think it's been too much for the last 2 years since we had our second daughter. I really haven't even put as much energy into the center as I think it deserved. I feel like I don't know, I had some misgivings. I didn't support the teachers as much as I would have liked to in certain ways, outside of giving them opportunities. And so, I feel like trying to slug on for another couple years just doesn't make any sense. So I've got this email that's sitting here waiting to go out to tell everybody that I'm closing the center. I haven't sent out the official notice yet. It's just waiting to go out, and I think I'm going to send it out tomorrow. And this podcast will go out several days after that. So when you hear this, I will have already sent it out, the official notice. And on one level, I don't have any doubt about it. It's the only choice to make. But I guess I'm anticipating the emotional upheaval of so many people I care about and know who have shared in that place with me, having to come to the realization that it will end. So again, I'm going to do one more round of my teacher training starting in May, and if anybody listening to this has ever considered wanting to do that, you've got one more chance to do it with me. And if anybody listening to this has come to the center and enjoyed it, you've got 8 more months to come around and get a little bit more practice in. But the story does not end there, my friends, not in the least. I'm not really seeing this as a tragedy. I see it as a success. I just had a 10-year run. That's pretty damn good. And I don't think it means the death of the independent center. There'll be more people doing what I did. Maybe it only lasts 10 years, but there'll be more independent centers out there. I know, because I've been reaching out to them to see if they'll give me jobs teaching, which has definitely been encouraging, So I've got plans, and I've got some exciting new projects to announce to you. I will be doing that shortly. So if you're in the Brooklyn area, come hang out with me at the center while I'm still there. Got some time yet. Speaking of hanging out, if you're not in the Brooklyn area and you'd like to come hang out with me, I do have some gigs. I'm going to be in West Hartford, Connecticut, April 30th. I'm going to be at the Feathered Pipe Ranch in Montana, June 17th through 24th. You can find out about those events. You can read my blog and listen to the archives of this podcast and find my video offerings at jbrownyoga.com. I want to thank those of you who went to iTunes and wrote a review. That was very nice of you. Thank you. If you're somebody who's been listening to the podcast and you wanted to show some support, that's a nice thing to do. You could go to iTunes and subscribe and write a review. Or if you wanted to really directly support me in this podcast, you could go to a blog or podcast page and make a donation. Thank you, as always, to you guys who did that this last week. I was very appreciative of those gestures. Thank you very much for that. Okay, I will touch base with you on the other side on a few things, like who's coming on next week. But for now, let's go ahead and talk to Donna Farhi.
Not the most easeful of days.
Oh my gosh, not in the least, but look at that. I had sort of given up a little bit of hope, and then I got your email, and right at the moment when I figured it out.
I'm fine to talk now.
You are? Do you have time? I'm not screwing up your day or anything like that?
No, it would take a lot more than this to mess up my day.
Oh, well, that's nice. I appreciate that.
I've just been quietly paying my bills here as I've been waiting for this to come together. So no, it's given me a chance to do my end of week tidy up. So no problem at all.
Oh, well, I so appreciate you being a calm presence. It has been a hectic day for me, and then this trouble getting signed on with you was just adding grist to the mill. But I'm very glad to speak to you now, and I appreciate you being so flexible.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. I've been really interested in your work for some time, and the story that you're telling is very familiar to me, even though it appears to be a modern story. To me, it's not a modern story. It's a story that's been going on for a long, long time. But it seems as if now people are telling this story out loud, rather than in the secret kind of backwaters of the yoga world as we know it.
Wow, that's a really amazing thing to hear you say. We've never met, and you're kind of like a mythical figure in certain ways to me. I think it's partly because I was sort of here on the East Coast, and I think you were on the West Coast. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was in the Bay Area for quite some time. Although I've got a very mixed cultural past in that I was born in the U.S. and my father, who originally worked for NASA and then for McDonnell Douglas, he had the bright idea to move our family with 5 kids to New Zealand when I was 10. And I hated it, and put myself on a plane when I was 19 and took myself back to the U.S. And at that time, it was to pursue a dance scholarship at California Institute of the Arts, and stayed till I was about 33. And then touring New Zealand on a teaching tour in my early 30s, I met a man who I was very much in love with, and decided to return to New Zealand, a place I'd never thought I'd ever return to. So I'm a dual citizen. I'm both American and Kiwi, and both cultures live in me in the way that they've both been very influential to me over time. Although now I would say my identity is much more strongly cleaved to New Zealand because I've been here much longer.
Yeah,
now than I have.
What was the year when you moved back to New Zealand?
Oh, 56. Mental calculation
I'm making you do
here.
math off the top of your head, huh?
I can't. My father can.
Yeah, no, me too.
He's a great mathematician.
I feel bad because I know if someone did it to me, I would struggle. But I'm just curious. I'm trying to get like a time frame, honestly, in relationship to when your books came out. Like I'm looking at one of what I see is maybe your first book called The Breathing Book was published in 1996.
Yeah, 1994 is when I returned.
Okay, so
to New Zealand.
So you returned to New Zealand after your time in California, and after your dance work, did you start to teach yoga in California? I assume you did because you were teaching since like the 80s, right?
Yeah. Well, what happened was I trained. I had been training for about 7 years, and originally dance for me was this very joyous experience. I experienced it as quite a transcendent thing to dance, and it's a curious story because it kind of mirrors my story later with my experience of having more formal instruction with yoga. As I became more and more technically adept as a dancer, I started to feel more and more empty. And I started to, I felt that I'd just become a machine, really. I wasn't really understanding why I was dancing anymore or enjoying it. And
so it just became more like exercise and technique and less about expression?
I just felt like a shell. That's the best way to describe it. And throughout my dance training, I had been practicing yoga daily as well because I started yoga before I started training as a dancer. And
when did that start? Like, what was your? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm always curious, like, what someone's first yoga class was. So, what was your first yoga class if you started doing yoga before dance?
My first yoga class was at high school here in New Zealand. It was offered as an elective by a physical education instructor, and a very small group of what would now be the equivalent of the super nerds in the school showed up for this yoga class, and I was one of them.
I see. And why, as a what as a young super nerd, appealed to you about going to the yoga? Can you remember why you would decide to go to that strange thing?
Because everyone else went off swimming, there was almost no interest whatsoever in this yoga class. But there were like a handful of us that showed up. And it was a really profound experience for me because I didn't feel at ease at school for lots of reasons. Being an American at that time in New Zealand was not an easy thing to be. Being anything different or anything foreign at that time in New Zealand was fraught with peril. And I wasn't at ease at home. There were all kinds of things going on in my family life that made me feel very insecure. And during that first yoga class, I felt the most extraordinary calm come over me. And it just blew me away. I couldn't believe that I could do something that could conjure up that feeling of safety in my body. And within a few days, I had acquired a copy of Richard Hittleman's 28-Day Plan.
Wow. Everybody who cites that book. I can't tell you how many people cite that book on this podcast.
It's such a great book. It's so simple. It's so accessible. And I started practicing on my own for about an hour and a half every day. religiously, which now as a teacher, if someone were to bring their 16-year-old daughter to class and tell me she's been practicing yoga every day religiously by herself, I think this is a very strange young woman.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. So that's how I was introduced to it. And then I just became an autodidact in the sense of practicing by myself for 7 years without any formal instruction.
Okay, so did all of that self-practice in yoga play into you wanting to do dance?
It wasn't so much that it played into me wanting to do dance, because I really saw myself primarily as a dancer, not a yogi.
I see.
Then. But when I decided to stop dancing, which was in itself pretty upsetting to me because I couldn't imagine myself as anything other than a dancer, I decided that I would put all of my energy into practicing yoga. And I was in the Bay Area, and that's where the San Francisco Iyengar Yoga Institute was. And I thought, I could do this. Well, at that time, it was like the Harvard of yoga teacher training programs in the U.S.
That's right. It was the gold standard, I remember.
It was, and Judith Lasater was there, and one of the key pieces of advice that I'd been given by a mentor in bodywork was, if you want to study something, go to the best. Study with the best. And she had just finished her physical therapy degree and was about to embark on a PhD in East-West psychology, and it was a very good match for me to study with her. Maybe not such a good match to do the training at the Institute, but I should say that at that time, the training was very, very different, and the climate, the culture around Iyengar was very, very different in those early days than it is now.
How so? How do you think it was different?
Well, I can remember having a conversation with the director when I went out to the Institute to explore the idea of doing the program, and I remember asking her the question, this, Iyengar isn't a guru or anything, because I'm not into having a guru. And she said, oh, no, we never use the word guru. No, he's a yoga master. And at that time, the Institute was very inclusive. They were inviting Feldenkrais teachers like Frank Wildman. They were inviting Alexander teachers. They had meditation teachers from other traditions, completely outside of the Iyengar fold, coming in and teaching classes. And it was a really wonderful program in many ways. And by the time I'd just about completed the program, the word Guruji started insinuating itself into the lingo around the Institute, and then edicts were delivered to the Institute that they had to stop inviting anyone from outside the tradition. And about that time as well, Iyengar yoga centers were given very clear guidelines that they weren't to have teachers from other methods. And that was not part of what was happening at the Institute when I first studied there.
Wow. And I'm curious, before those edicts came down and people started referring to him as Guruji, was there always like level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 classes?
Such a long time ago,
Yeah.
but I know within the teacher training program, yes, you had to do asana 1, and then you had to learn how to teach asana 1, asana 2. By the time you got to asana 4, it was like the black belt Seriously.
Yeah. Well, because I just know that that's
Like,
always.
we're not messing around here, on your heads for 20 minutes.
Yes, well, I always see that as a little bit of a signature, that there's a level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and you're not supposed to do level 2 until after you can do level 1. But you're talking about all these different things happening at that Iyengar Center, like Feldenkrais and stuff. So I was just sort of curious if that was still in place back then or not. But maybe it's too long ago.
Well, it was concurrent with the program that was in place.
Yeah.
And you got to remember that this was a very new program, and that they were formulating their curriculum. They had it registered through the state of California as, I think, an occupational program, or I don't know exactly the terminology, but it was licensed through the state of California, and that in itself was quite remarkable. And what a lot of people don't understand is that you can graduate, at least then, I don't know what the rules are now, but you can graduate from the program, which is 2 years of full-time training, which is different than getting certified, which is something that now, then happened more through Iyengar in India. So technically speaking, you can be a successful graduate of the Institute, which it was, but into the future you might not be certified.
You had to get blessing.
You
have to get.
Yeah, well, I was certified, and then for ethical reasons I decided not to renew my certification. So
well,
that
I guess that's kind of my next question, because Judith Hanson-Lassiter came on this podcast, and she spoke about that time. And she spoke about when she left the Iyengar Association and why she did that, because of some misconduct by one of the teachers there, and about how she raised that, and she was very unhappy with the way it came down from the top and how they were dealing with that. And I'm curious if you were around during then, and if that had something to do with your decision to kind of move away from it as well, or if that's a separate thing.
I was very involved with all of that. I mean, Judith and I were close colleagues at the time, and I was on a board with Yoga Journal magazine. I'm very aware of the, in terms of the ethical transgressions that were going on, and not just at the Institute. There was a lot going on in the field of ethics at that time, and but that was one of the reasons I decided not to renew my certification. But I felt the primary reason I decided not to renew my certification was that I felt I could no longer represent that method, and nor did I want to have an outside body put a choke chain around my neck, and every time I didn't teach something in a prescribed way, have a little kind of pull on my neck to discipline or chastise, or but I just honestly didn't think I could say that what I was teaching represented that method, and nor did I want to represent myself that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you made that decision that you no longer felt like you could represent that method, where did you go from there, like in your practice and teaching?
Well, that decision then is like being cast out into outer darkness, really. It's like being excommunicated from a church. I mean, people now go their own way, create new brands and hybridizations of yoga practices, very, very common. But in that time, it was a very radical, dangerous thing to do. And when I moved, I'll give you an idea about how dangerous it was, because I returned to New Zealand soon after I made that decision. And previously, when I toured here, my intensives were really full, and the students, they were packed, and the students were very receptive to what it was that I was offering. And I returned here, and I had a 3-city tour, and the head of the then Iyengar Association contacted every single host on the tour and threatened them, sometimes for hours on the phone, or multiple phone calls, saying that if they continued to host me, that they would have their certification revoked.
Blacklisted, eh?
Blacklisted. And then pretty much after that, all the doors shut. No one would host me.
Now, let me ask you a question. I know that you were a columnist for Yoga Journal for a while, and also Yoga International. Now, were you already doing that? Like, had you already established yourself as like a senior Iyengar teacher before you made that choice?
I certainly wasn't established as a senior Iyengar teacher. I was established as a long-time writer with Yoga Journal. I'd written features and I'd been the asana columnist for many years for them, and then went to Yoga International, was the asana columnist for them. So it was known because those magazines at that time were like a nexus for the community internationally, not just in the U.S. but all around the world.
And when you say the community, are you specifically referring to the Iyengar community?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say who the readers then of the magazine were, but I know statistically when the magazine did an analysis of why readers were buying the magazine, the primary reason they were buying the magazine was the asana column.
Yeah.
People were very interested to be able to read detailed information about asana.
I know, and that's kind of what I'm getting at, because you've said that at a certain point you no longer felt like you could represent that method, and that's after already having been published for years on how to do that method.
Well, if you read my writing, my older writing, and I'm about to re-release those archival writings, it's about 200 pages of writing that I'm going to re-release, you'll see that I'm speaking about something that's very different than what I'd been taught. And I'm speaking between the lines in many of those columns about sensing an instinctual alignment that we all have, that I'd intuited from practicing on my own for many, many years before getting any formal instruction. So my columns weren't really representative of the Iyengar approach. But when I say I didn't think I could represent the method per se, more specifically, I could not adhere to the pedagogic model that really was coming from Iyengar on down. And I think it's an archaic model. I think it's a model that it almost doesn't matter the information you filter it through. You can take very safe information and you filter it through that model, and it can become dangerous. Just because of the nature, the model itself takes the power away from the individual to make their own choices. And so you can give someone a really safe practice, but then if you take away their power to decide what is my threshold, is this a practice that is appropriate for me? How long do I do it? When do I come out of it? If I take all of those decisions away from the student and put them in my domain as some kind of superior power, then it becomes a very dangerous proposition on a physical level, but there are lots of other levels in which it becomes, to me, unsound in terms of a model for yoga as a practice that brings about self-knowledge, self-realization, liberation, Yeah, one of the phenomena that I've been noticing, especially in the last 10 years, because I pretty much go around the world every year, sometimes twice a year. I do 2 long tours or I do 1 long tour, visiting very different cultures. And one of the things that I'm noticing is I'll look around the room and it appears that there are many people who are coming into intensives who have no foundational understanding of what they're doing. And when I'll approach these students and say, I'm really curious how long you've been working with a teacher. And they say, I've been going to classes for 10 years, and I'm utterly astounded. I cannot believe that they've had guidance for 10 years, but that's resulted in them having almost no knowledge whatsoever of why they are doing what they are doing. And it's extraordinary to me because that is information that someone would have if they did an 8-week beginner course with me.
Well, I think that's an interesting testament to the fact that people can go to yoga classes for many years and not get guidance. But you could go to yoga classes and have these practices without ever really learning about what you're doing and why you're doing it. You just sort of along for the ride.
Well, exactly. Techniques are easy to teach. Turn your left leg in, right leg out. All of that is kind of yoga for dummy stuff. It's very easy to teach in that way, just to play Simon Says. Mm-hmm. But what I notice more is that the students have not developed the capacity to inquire or investigate. So a really common exchange in an intensive for me might be someone saying, I feel discomfort in this position, and I'll say, I wonder what you could do about that. And they'll just look at me utterly stunned. What do you mean? What could I do about this? Because it hasn't even occurred to them that they might investigate or alter their position or experiment or inquire into their first port of call. Their only port of call is to ask the teacher what to do. Mm-hmm. And that's where our conversation begins. For me, that's to say, okay, let's have a conversation about this. Let's experiment together. And you tell me why this is feeling better or why you think this is making this better or worse. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's a very exciting exchange because by the end of 25 hours, 5 days, hopefully, I've begun that process of inquiry so they can build some real skills.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree. And I also think that is a two-way street. Like, it is a student who needs to be on board for that, but it's also the teacher who's setting that. Because I know I have this one story from maybe a couple years ago. I had a teacher trainee who was working with me, and I teach a practice that's very much about not necessarily going to end ranges, like really working in a more balanced way rather than trying to push it to your physical edges. And part of their requirements in the training is to go try other approaches to practice. And she had gone to a pretty standard vinyasa class, and I believe they were in some kind of lunge position, and she was just doing it in a much more like stability kind of stance rather than like an extension or stretch stance kind of way. And the teacher came up to her and said, "Are you not trying hard on purpose?" and she said, "Yes." And to his credit, I will say he left her alone. He didn't make her do more, but it just seemed like in that class, that was a foreign idea, that not only was she making a determination for herself, but that she was making a determination not to try to push it all the way,
Well, the premise here is that pushing and forcing is an intelligent way to open the body, or the only way to open the body. And our understanding of the body is so much more sophisticated now, and I've never found that strain strengthens, or that forceful opening of the body results in any kind of real unfolding of the body.
How did that unfold for you from the time that you left Younger? Like, did you come back to your personal practice experiences and the love? I'm still thinking about the dance, because we were talking about you doing dance and how you got to a point where you felt like an empty shell. And I'm sort of, was there any kind of parallel there with the yoga, and then you had to, I don't know, I'm sort of curious about that time when...
There is a parallel, because I think I took things as far as I could go with the Iyengar method, and it was very physically intense, and I had a lot of pain in my body. In fact, I was told by one of my senior teachers in my final years at the Institute that if I wasn't in pain all the time, I wasn't practicing hard enough. And I believed him, so I practiced hard enough to be in pain all the time. As some kind of proof that I was a serious, dedicated practitioner. But post that, I did just dive into my own practice. There really weren't many teachers I could go to for guidance as to now what. And I had quite a pivotal moment in going to a postgraduate school to talk to a dean about going into their master's or their PhD program. And the person I was supposed to talk to about the program wasn't there. So someone else was there that day. And if you look at this symbolically, I'm leaving this method that's filled with rules and details and the 52 points of triangle pose, and it's heavily prescriptive. And I feel like I've been cast into outer darkness when I really do not know how I'm going to continue to practice and teach. And, of course, what do?
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.